All right. So good morning, everyone, once again, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Winnie Ogejo, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs under the Futures and Foresights program. So the Institute of Economic Affairs, for those who are joining us for the first time, is a public policy institute that carries out research and uses the research findings to have conversations and discourses that lead to possible policy recommendations and policy implementation. So we cut across 6 different programs, and today's conveners are the Futures and Foresights program, but we also have the Constitution, Law and Economics program, the Economic Regulation the Economic Competition Regulation Program, the Popular Economics Program, the International Trade Program, the Public Finance Management Program, and our communications team. So this morning, we want to have a conversation on a report that we worked on last year, for the better part of last year, and was actually published late last year. And before we go into the main agenda, I'd like to inform us that we will all be on mute as we will be having the conversation. But during the plenary, you will have an opportunity to have your questions. And if you want to type it in the chat box, you'll have the opportunity to type it as the conversation goes on. But if you want to voice it, you will voice it at the end of the presentations. So what are we having the conversation on today? So this morning, we want to have a conversation on the 4 paths to Kenya in 2024, just so that we know where are we in July 2024. And this is in relation to the report that I've earlier mentioned, Kenya in 2040, Mapping Kenya's Future. So just to give you a background on this report, so I indicated that we carried out this research, or we did this, we wrote this research last year, and it is just based on scenarios to give us an idea of what Kenya would look like in the year 2040. But sitting back and looking at these scenarios, we realize that there probably are some aspects of these scenarios that are actually already playing out. So we wanted to understand of the scenarios, where are we in where are we as at July 2024? Has 2040 come in 2024, or are there parts of our vision of 2040 already playing out in 2024? And remember, when you're coming up with scenarios, you're not coming up with scenarios so that you're being predictive. No, you're coming up with scenarios so that you're giving possibilities. They might play out and they might not play out. And when you're coming up with the scenarios, again, you have to give it a time frame where a generation can actually live to see these scenarios play out or not play out, so that if somebody reads these scenarios in 2024, or let's say in 2023 when they were published, and now they can now start relating with the happenings in the country and relate it back and say, well, I read this report and some of these things that are currently happening are actually in that report. I've given you a very quick background on what scenarios are, and I've told you they are not predictions, they're actually possibilities. So they are just descriptions or outlines of possible sequence of events or hypothetical situations, meaning it might happen or it might not happen. But given our experience at the IEA with even the previous scenarios that we have conducted, you can clearly tell that if you carry out scenarios in the right way and correctly, most definitely certain aspects of your scenarios or the scenarios in their entirety would actually play out. And what then do we sit back and come up with scenarios? So the main reason we come up with scenarios is so that we envision the future. And as we envision the future, we are in a position to prepare for potential challenges, opportunities, or even uncertainties. So with the scenarios, you're better preparing yourself for the future. And remember, when you're preparing yourself, it is not because you know it is whatever is going to happen in the future is going to happen. No, it's because you're just being ready for whatever outcome that happens in the future. And so quickly into our methodology that we used for these scenarios for those who are interacting with them for the first time. And I would encourage us to read these scenarios because they're very, very interesting. They give us two aspects. They give us the journey narratives and they give us the technical narratives. So for today, we will dwell on the journey narratives. Of course, while you'll be reading them, you will encounter the technical narratives, and feel free to reach out to us if you find difficulty unpacking those technical narratives. But today we want to dwell on the journey narratives. So anytime you're coming up with scenarios, what you do is you have to work with the picture of now. So as the Institute of Economic Affairs, we sat back and wrote a picture of now. We sat through, looked at the country, unpacked what was happening in the country at that time, and did a whole write-up on it. Of that write-up, we came up with this beautiful word cloud you're seeing on your screen. And this word cloud is what we used to form our two main pillars or our two central uncertainties that we will be working with. So the word cloud is not something we just came up with. No, the word cloud is of what we call our picture of now. Our picture of now was our reality at that time. What was happening in Kenya is what we wrote down, put it in the and came up with this word cloud. And of this word cloud, we came up with our two central uncertainties. And if you look at that word cloud proper, you notice that there are two main things that come out. We have constitutional implementation issues. And this emerged because at that time we had political tensions. Remember, it was that time we were having the BBI conversation. And then, of course, the judicial independence was also an issue at that time, where the independence of the judiciary in this country was being questioned. And of course, with the BBI conversation going on, the one thing that was very clear was a constitutional amendment. There was a level of constitutional amendment that was required. Even as we were having those conversations on the BBI, there were some laws that were going to change, regulations that were going to change, and all this were linked back to our constitutionality. So the constitutional implementation was in jeopardy. We were questioning so many things about our constitutionality. And then, of course, when you look at our economic potential, we were having conversations on our fiscal slippage. There were a lot of corruption cases going on. There were a lot of there was a lot of mismanagement conversations going on at that point. And of course, we also had conversations on our debt management. And we actually thought that we were not doing well as far as our debt management was concerned. And beyond that, the way we were always surpassing the debt ceiling and increasing it just so that we can borrow more and more and more. And we know what happens when you can't manage your debt as a country. And of course, we wrote these scenarios at a time when COVID-19 shocked the whole world, and we know what that shock did to us as a country and our economy and just our social well-being. So based off that picture of now, we came with the picture of now then formed the basis for our central uncertainties, and we came up with two central uncertainties. We felt that for our economic development, for our general development, there are two things that need to play out. There are two things that we really need to work on, and we need to work on these two things together. We cannot work on one and neglect the other. For us to get to a space where we are seeing our sunny days as a country, then these two central uncertainties have to really, really be put at the same level. So these two central uncertainties were the institutional quality and the policy direction, meaning depending on which policy direction or which institutional direction we chose to take, then some scenario would actually play out. And just to quickly unpack the two scenarios, the four scenarios, sorry, we had Madaraka realized, and under Madaraka realized, we are saying we have institutional renaissance and we have progressive policy stances. So you can clearly tell that with institutional renaissance, the institutions are performing within their mandate and there is some level of independence, so meaning they're more efficient. And then, of course, with progressive policy stances, we have a situation where policies are being enforced and implemented, and the policies are actually leading to development and are not retrogressive. So when we are coming up with these scenarios, I take you back a bit. Now comes in our journey narrative. So we want you to picture Sarah, and as our speakers will be coming in, we want them to tell us whether what Sarah woke up to see is what is actually happening in the current country currently. So we are saying if Sarah comes to the country, the year is 2040, she comes back to Kenya. What does she see? And under Madaraka realized, Sarah sees finds judicial independence and efficacy where the judiciary is performing independently. There is no interference from the executive, and things are running for the country. And then, of course, she comes up she comes up to find that there are the state-owned enterprise reforms are actually being implemented, and institutions that are not performing or are fully relying on the government for bailouts are actually being reformed, are actually being privatized. And we also see that institutions performing similar mandates are being amalgamated. So Sarah wakes up to a country that is actually on the right path, okay? And then under managed stagnation, Sarah comes and finds institutions are performing, but the policies are not supporting that performance, meaning we are having retrogressive or what we will call defensive policy stance. So we have an efficient and effective public sector, but the policies are very protectionist. And because the policies are protectionist, what happens is our private sector is largely underdeveloped. And we know that the private sector plays a huge role in our economic development. Their contribution to the GDP cannot be downplayed. So we really need a developed private sector for our economy to thrive. So Sarah wakes up to a private sector that is largely underdeveloped. So that support, the economic growth that the private sector gives to Kenya is not where it should be. She might wake up, she might come back and walk into a Juakali Kingdom country. And under Juakali Kingdom, we have policies that are working. We have policies that are very, very progressive if implemented. But because of the lack of political goodwill, these policies are not being implemented as should. And so we know what happens when policies are not being implemented, especially because of a lack of political goodwill. And then, of course, we're coming with the progressive policy stance. We experience certain things such as the simplified tax regime, and we know what a simplified tax regime means for a country, and even for foreign investors and even internal investors. So Sarah wakes up to that level of certainty when it comes to tax regime. People can actually predict which direction our tax environment is taking. But because the lack of political goodwill, there's a bit of confusion and there's a bit of tension. She might come back and wake up to an eastern and come back to an eastern sunset. If Sarah comes back to an eastern sunset, what Sarah comes back to is a country that is in shambles, a country where the policies are very defensive and the institutions are not performing within their mandate. So things are not working. And if that is happening, then what happens is we have very rigid labor policies. There's a lack of judicial independence. The constitution is not being implemented as should, and there's a broken constitutional order. We have breached our debt ceiling over and over again, and so our public debt has also breached our GDP. What we are collecting is not even sufficient for public service delivery and provision. And then, of course, we know what happens if what we have is not sufficient. There is disruption in the provision of public goods and services. So we just wanted to introduce these scenarios so that as people, for those who have not interacted with our scenarios, you can have an opportunity to now understand what these scenarios actually mean. So there's also a technical aspect which Kwame would speak to when he's making his presentation, just to give you an overview, but just so that you understand that there are certain things that we said would be possible in 2040, that the big question we are asking right now, has 2040 come in earlier than we anticipated? Or are we just having a taste of 2040? And if we are having a taste of 2040, what does that mean for us as a country? Should we be tightening our seatbelts for more hardships to come? Or is there a possibility for us to retract our steps and sit back and do certain things differently, so that we have institutions that are performing and we have policies being implemented as they should actually be? So that was just to jog your mind and introduce these scenarios to you so that you understand what we are going to be speaking to. And with us today, this morning, we have three speakers. We have Nancy Muigai, who works at the Summit of the Future Network, Viva Africa School of International Futures, who is a futurist and has had an opportunity to go through these scenarios and just look at them. So she will be giving us her views and her thoughts on these scenarios. And Nancy had also had an opportunity to work with the IEA on another set of scenarios. So she might have an opportunity to link those scenarios to this and just tell us her thoughts on these scenarios and link them to the current state of affairs of the country. And we also have Carol Komisiko. Carol works at the Old Mutual Group as the Group Sustainability, Risk and Compliance Executive, and has also had an opportunity to read these scenarios, and she'll also be giving us her thoughts on where she thinks within those four scenarios we fall as a country, and what possible recommendations they both might have, leading us to the sunny day, which is Madaraka Realized, where we are celebrating, and Kenya is where we actually think it should be. And of course, Kwame will come in and also, based off what Nancy and Carol will tell us, give us his views on their views. And then we will move to the plenary session and then close the meeting. So without further ado, I would like to invite Miss Nancy to take us through her thoughts and her possible recommendations. And as she's giving us her thoughts, she'll try to tell us why she thinks we are in whatever scenario she thinks, and then we will proceed. Remember, if you have any questions as the panelists will be making their presentations, please feel free to type in your questions and we will respond during the plenary. So karibu sana Nancy, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to introduce myself, my name is Nancy Muigai, not Nancy Muigai, but that said, my name is not quite common. But that said, I'm a strategic foresight specialist, but also a governance advisor around anti-corruption work. And many years ago, I had an opportunity working with the Institute of Economic Affairs, and one of the piece of work that we did alongside my mentor then and also colleague, Dr. Katindi Sivi, was the Kenya Youth Scenarios. This is quite interesting because in 2009, 2010, we went around the country meeting over 200 young people in the 8 provinces. And then we had one national workshop. And what essentially we were trying to understand 14 years ago is how will the youth shape the future of Kenya? And we wanted to really understand in terms of time horizon, where would Kenya be 20 years from now? And at that particular time in 2010, that was looking into 2030. And it's interesting because one of the interesting futures that these young people at that particular point did come out with were 4 scenarios. One of it was the Ocean scenario, which really depicted a leadership that recognized the power of the majority and the growing youth population and invested in them through comprehensive social programs, and the country would harness the demographic dividend to avert the crisis. And so this was basically a situation where the country was ready to be able to deal with the growing youth population, but also dealing with the different critical uncertainties around inequality, around development, and many other aspects. We also had what we called the tsunami scenario, which is the scenario where it portrayed high inequalities, high unemployment levels, and slow implementation of the constitution due to poor leadership and a global financial crisis that hit the country at that particular point. As a result of this, there was a lot of disenfranchisement of young people, and by 2031, they had formed a revolutionary front, and by 2031, a state of emergency was declared. And so this is an interesting scenario, because if you follow through with the Kenya youth scenarios, you should be able to see that some of the scenarios playing out here is what we are currently seeing. Unfortunately, we are not in 2031 yet. The other scenarios is pond scenario and waterfall scenario. A pond scenario assumes the stagnation, and the scenario represented an inertia where most youth felt helpless and were unable to challenge bad governance, human rights abuses, and impunity, and they coped through various addictions, with depression and suicide attempts escalating. And then the last one was water scenario. This was basically where young people intensely demanded changes such as job provision and economic growth. Once these demands were met, they retreated from political participation to pursue other interests. I really wanted to begin with this because it's very, I sense that there's a segue between these scenarios and also the four pathways that we look at on these particular scenarios that we're about to discuss. I just wanted to just say that foresight is really the capacity to think systematically about the future to inform decision making today. They're not predictions. And when you have a very good foresight exercise, it will help you to build a vision by making strategic choices and to create the future that we want, or the future that you desire, and also to be able to manage the risks and also increase organization awareness and agility. We are also living in a world where there's lots of multiple things happening, and what I would describe, and what Jeremy Bentham, who worked for Shell Scenarios for a very long time, describes as there are strong countercurrents in the world, and they always generate countercurrents, and it's really hard to know in advance which will be more powerful than the other. And so this is countercurrents in the sense that economic, technological, social, political. And so because it's very hard to be able to ascertain what is going to be strong in the future, it's good to explore multiple outcomes to make the wisest decision ever. Looking at the current Kenya at 2040, I think the two critical uncertainties that we are presented here is the policy, the institutional quality, which is really assessing the state capacity and the level in which the state is effective, inclusive, and accountable. But on the other hand, being able to look at the direction of policy. And so progressive policy choices, or the progressive policy stance, is where there is this particular open economy that nurtures an environment conducive for development, or a sophisticated private sector, while the other contrary is basically the defensive policy stance, which essentially protects the interest of the vested interest of the few, and basically the political interest of the others. And so given these particular policy choices and looking at the different scenarios, I would say, from looking at both Madaraka, which is essentially the best case scenario, I would say that this is not where we are at the moment, because in Madaraka scenario, Sarah, some of the critical things that are happening in this particular scenario is that there's an improvement in state capacity accompanied by greater economic freedom and transition towards a private sector-led economic growth model. I would really say that this is not where we are, but it could be a path that Kenya could be going towards. My sense in terms of looking at the scenarios is that we seem to be oscillating between Jua Kali Kingdom and the managed stagnation. What do I mean by this? In the Jua Kali kingdom is where, for instance, the informal sector seems to be thriving. And because the informal sector is thriving, the incentives that have been created for the Mwananchi to be able to formalize their informal sector are not quite good enough. And so because of that, they end up retreating back to the informal sector. And so a very good example is when you see Sarah waking up and they have had this particular company where they have been making spices for a very long time. However, because of the weak state capacity, they are unable to really think of ways in which they can be able to improve their sector. And then when you look at managed stagnation, it's essentially where I would say Kenya sits at this particular point. And the managed stagnation scenario sees an improvement in state capacity, but the policy direction prevents the development of a sophisticated private sector. However, this particular scenario envisages an improvement of issues to do with services, improved basic services, and corruption accompanied by restriction on private sector activities in inward and looking trade policies. I would say that this is not where we are at. So it seems like we are in between Jua Kali Kingdom and managed stagnation. We might not necessarily be exactly where these scenarios envisage itself in 2040, but we are in between these two issues. And why I say this is because when you look at the institutions today in Kenya and you try and understand where they sit, the question is, are our institutions effective? Are they inclusive? Are they accountable? I think there is it's a mixed bag in the sense that there are particular institutions that seems to be working really well, especially when you look at the work that the Auditor General is currently doing, when you look at some of the rulings that are coming out of the judiciary, and if you look at some of the different approaches in terms of what's currently happening. However, to what extent can we be able to say that some of these institutions are accountable, especially when you look at the three arms of government, when you look at parliament, and even when you look at the crisis that we are having at this particular point in time. And so I think for me, one of the key takeaway points that I sort of take from this particular issue is that when we look at the strategic foresight spectrum, is that we are seeing the weak signals that could either lead us to either an eastern sunset or could either lead us into a Jua Kali kingdom if things are left the way they are. And so what we are seeing right now are basically what you would say weak signals, and weak signals essentially are things that we don't take, like, we take them for granted, but over time, if left unchecked and if nothing happens in terms of action, then you end up with a situation where you regret why you are actually there. And that is the essence really about foresight exercises, and a scenario exercise of this nature is that we should be able to make wise choices. We should be able to avoid a situation where we get ourselves into an eastern sunset, because when you look at the eastern sunset, it's really an ineffective state which is accompanied by a policy environment that is not conducive for the development of a vibrant private sector. It's inadequate in terms of basic services, and excessive bureaucracy are indicative of institutional weaknesses. And apart from that, when you look at all of these particular things, the question you really ask yourself is that even with a picture of where we are right now, are Kenyans satisfied with the institutions that we have? And we can already see it, especially when we look at the discussions that the Gen Zs are having, but also what is playing out in terms of our policy space. I think one of the key things, especially when you're thinking about strategic foresight and looking at why these particular exercises are very much important, is that you should be able to be humble enough to listen to the different perspectives and to listen and understand what others are also being able are bringing on board, because this entire exercise is a collective intelligence exercise, and it being an intelligence exercise, we should be able to use these insights to be able to inform government, to be able to inform even the interventions that we are making to ensure that we have a responsive state, but also we get out of the crisis. But I ask myself, what happens in a situation where those that are in a crisis don't realize that they are in a crisis? How important do these scenarios exercises are? How important are these particular scenarios, right? And so for me, one of the key things that I would say in terms of looking at the takeaway points from these scenarios is, one is that I think the government has been offered a time to do a reset, and it's almost similar to what the world is currently going on right now, which is we are going through a reset post COVID-19, where a lot of institutions have failed. The multilateral system has failed, and it's very evident even in the scenario, in the managed scenario. One of the scenarios, in I think Jua Kali, where we sort of see the failure of the multilateral systems. And so, in a sense, government has been offered, and I mean, when I mean government, I mean the leadership who are in government right now have been offered a time to be able to reset. However, the question is, would they be able to use this reset to make informed choices and to be able to walk back the country back into the path that it should ideally walk into? The other aspect as well is that, and I think it's a question to the Institute of Economic Affairs, is that I know looking at the different critical uncertainties, especially around progressive policy stance and also institutional capacity, I know one of the key things that these particular scenarios seems to sort of to criticize is the whole notion around protectionism, the whole notion around regulations. But the question I would seek to be able to ask is that, is protectionism or putting out regulations a bad thing in itself? Because if you look at evidence, and if you look at even the issues around international sovereign bonds, and how, for instance, most of the countries that have taken international sovereign bonds have been exposed at the debt level, to the extent that, especially if you're looking at the case of the likes of Sri Lanka, or you're looking at Argentina, or looking at even Ghana, you would realize that these particular sovereign bonds have left these countries in a way that hasn't been quite progressive. And so, in essence, when we are thinking about regulations and that kind of thinking, shouldn't the government be able to put in strong measures in the way in which it negotiates with these international institutions? Because when you look at even the way in which the sovereign bonds are done, is that when a country gets downgraded, and a good example is that Kenya has just been downgraded by Moody's, your sovereign bonds also gets downgraded, and also it means that you have to pay an interest at a higher level, because now your bonds are no longer as useful as they were, or valuable as they were in the start. And so the question here is, does the current economic model serve Kenyans, or continues to perpetuate inequality when combined with a political patronage and fragmented implementation of the constitution, right? And this is really where, as I conclude and as I look at these particular scenarios, I sort of say that we are in between a Jua Kali kingdom and a managed stagnation. A Jua Kali kingdom because citizens have been left to figure out how to navigate the market on their own. And because the incentives to formalize the economy have not been quite progressive enough, you find that many prefer to remain informal. However, the state has had a fragmented and mixed approach in terms of how it responds to governmental issues, especially around accountability, around effectiveness of this institution, and even inclusivity. And a very good question is the whole notion around representation, how women are represented within government, and how women are participating in these particular spaces. I would say that there are very few women who are in key decision-making places in this particular country, yet they form almost half of this particular population. And my question really, when I'm looking at these particular scenarios, is really the question that hasn't really been talked about. And it's the third horse. And it's the third horse that has always been missing, especially when we look at our election, because our democratic elections have always been seen as a two-horse race. However, when you look at the last election, there were many people who didn't vote compared to those that voted. Could it be this this is the voice of the third horse that was missing in the ballot, because our political representation or democratic representation politics doesn't take into cognizance why people don't vote apart from just apathy in itself. And so could this be the voice of this silent majority that is speaking to us now? And how do we navigate it from here? Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much, Nancy, for your views on the scenarios, and just indicating that for you, you feel that we are in between managed stagnation, largely because we have institutions that are performing within their mandates, but we have policies that are not supporting that performance. And of course, you're also saying Joakali Kingdom, because we have institutions that are not performing and policies that are actually supporting. So largely saying we are in between makes a lot of sense, because even the pointers that you're giving in terms of our economic development and some of the hindrances. Of course, we have some hindrances largely because of institutions that are part of that hindrance, and we have some that are largely because of policy. And just listening to this, like you've mentioned, the Gen Z conversation, and generally it's no longer a Gen Z conversation, it's the whole of Kenya conversation with the finance bill. That was largely a policy conversation going on that has roped in more issues linking to institutions and policies. So rightly to say we could be in between, but let's hear what Carol has to say and her views in terms of where she thinks we are as far as these scenarios are concerned. So Carol, karibu sana. Karibu.
Yeah, asante. So thank you, Winnie, for inviting me to this discussion. And more so, thank you so much for taking us through the scenarios and your thoughts. And also, Nancy, for those very insightful comments you made about the Kenya youth scenarios. So my name is Carol Misiko. I work in the private sector, in the insurance sector, actually. And we are consumers of some of these insights and scenarios that have been presented. But if I can just give a step back and give you the perspective with which we approach scenarios, or even how we consume the scenarios that have been developed. If I can just, like I said, take a step back, 2024 has been quite something, I think, from a global perspective. And they say that we are in the age of polycrises. So we are seeing a return of risks like inflation, cost of living crisis, trade wars, capital outflows from emerging markets, widespread social unrest, geopolitical confrontation. All of these things seem to be happening at the same time and accelerating at a pace that I think is unprecedented. And sitting within the corporate space and trying to navigate and plan and lead organizations, it becomes unwielding for us to think beyond a year. And so scenario planning helps us to be very deliberate about contemplating different but plausible scenarios and worlds in which our organization must be resilient and surviving. So receiving the scenarios that were done by IEA was very eye-opening in that it presented us with different plausible futures under which we as a private sector needed to navigate, plan for, and prepare for. So I think that the scenarios and the need for scenario planning could not have come at a much more better time, having just come out of the pandemic, where many of us had not developed economy grinds to a halt type of scenario. I think this forward-looking, very distinct scenario planning that is done by the IEA is very, very useful. I don't want to repeat much of what Nancy had said, because I do agree. When we look at the scenarios, trying to see where does Kenya sit at this point in time, I think there are tendrils and evidences that managed scenario, that we are very much in the managed stagnation scenario, where we have policies that policy direction that is beginning to stifle or could potentially stifle a robust development of the private sector. But there is improvement in state capacity. I think there are tendrils and evidences that this is where we are sitting in. But I think in light of the new developments over the last 3 months or so, I think we also see tendrils of what could possibly be the development of the Madaraka Realized. Why do I say that? I think there are exciting developments that point to an engaged citizenry that is willing now to challenge or to stress or test the capabilities of this new constitution that was voted in more than 2 decades ago. There's a citizenry ownership of the development of the economy. There's an ownership around the engagement around policy. There's an ownership that is emerging that I think could truly lead us to the Madaraka Realized scenario if it is shepherded and guided in the right direction. I love what was said about the Kenya youth scenarios, harnessing the demographic dividend. I think that was under the ocean scenario. And I think that is the opportunity that sits for us now, not to fall back into our default, which could easily be the Juakali kingdom or the managed stagnation. It is really about how do we shepherd and latch onto these tendrils that could be evolving and help us to move into the Madaraka Realized scenario. So Winnie, maybe I'll stop there. Those would be my initial thoughts here. Thank you.
All right. This is very interesting. Just the thought of a Madaraka Realized for Kenya, where we have institutions that are performing within their mandates, and we have policies that are actually supporting that, and the policies in turn support the growth of the private sector. So, as a practitioner in the private sector, it's very interesting to hear you mention that we are actually on the right path, for lack of a better word, towards Madaraka Realized. And I'd love to hear what the participants also have to say, given the current situation in the country. And just, that actually triggers something from my end, because for me, a Madaraka Realized is where I would love to be as a country. But I worry a lot with the lack, especially the lack of political goodwill that we experience in this country. So probably, Carol, you're right that we might be having policies that would actually spear us and steer us towards Madaraka Realized, but then the lack of political goodwill would actually stifle that progress. I'm not too sure our institutions would actually be very, very capable to support those certain policies, especially if it's not in line with their interests. And we've seen it happen in this country where if a policy is not to the interest of politicians or the policy makers, they sort of stifle it and it doesn't see the light of day. So maybe if we get them to be on the right path with us as well, then probably Madaraka Realized would actually be something we would celebrate as a country. But currently, well, let's hear what Kwame has to say, his views based off your views and Carol's views, sorry, Nancy's views, and then we can allow the participants also to share their views on where they think. But yeah, it's good to be optimistic, Carol, and we're excited about your optimism. But let's hear what Kwame also has to say. Thank you, Kwame.
All right, thanks a lot, and thanks. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I don't know that I needed to say anything, but anyway, let's say this. The underlying question around these scenarios was that we thought, looking into the future, that Kenya needed, or rather, there were two tensions. One of them was institutional quality tension, and then the other is the policy choice. And the conclusions we come with is that it's very, because those two are salient, those tensions around picking the right policy choices and picking the right constitutional model have to go together. But we understand that the temptation when an administration comes in, or in many people's choices, is to place one above the other. And I'm thinking that that's where we are in the conundrum we are today. That the administration came promising first a bottom-up model, suggesting that it would be mostly youth and mostly economic management, and that political and institutional reforms would be secondary, if at all. And to be honest, the hands were full. But our scenarios tells us that this is a moment that they're chastised. The idea that one can be traded off against the other is breaking right before our eyes for two reasons. The first is the saying, the idea that economic management is about splitting interests into so-called dynasties, and then the others, and working entirely for one and not the other, is very inspired political rhetoric. We are learning that it is poor economic logic. Because the same youth, the same lower income groups, who were supposed to be the beneficiaries, so to speak, of this model, to whom redistributive politics and redistributed expenditure was supposed to give the heft, seem to be the ones that are actually rejecting it. So I guess that's it. So it's just basically, what I'm trying to say is that the technical requirements and the political language have to go together. And they have to lead us, in my view, towards greater constitutional formation. Strengthening the constitution and the institutions, and at the same time lead to prosperity. And so it tells us that we are not necessarily heading towards Madaraka Realized. However, the language of politicians of this administration has been Madaraka Realized, but its tools have been at a different level, suggesting to me, like Nancy said, that Jua Kali Kingdom or managed stagnation is where the signals seem to be. I hope I'm not putting words in their mouth. Let me just say this. In my view, Jua Kali Kingdom and managed stagnation are where the stronger trends based on July 2021 suggest to us we might head to. All other factors kept constant. So that's the first. The second thing is that these scenarios also taught us that in the view of that along the journey, because Kenya had a constitutional order, and the concept and the imagined constitutional order gave certain rights. I think that's what's coming to the fore, because while Kenya's youth, you call them Generation Zs, but their parents have been behind them quite a bit as well, and that's been helpful. They are speaking the language of constitutional, institutions of the Constitution. I'm talking about economic and social rights, including the rights related to peaceful protest and petitioning state authorities, using that constitutional language to fashion out messages related to economic management and prosperity. So basically, again, confirming to us that it's neither one or the other. And so what people see as a crisis, in my view, was almost predictable. And I know scenarios are not about predictions, but because those tensions would show up in events such as this. So at classical moments when a big decision needs to be made, such as the finance bill, then if anybody assumes, and I think Parliament made this mistake by trying to make the public participation entirely ceremonial, but the decisions have been made, and then we watch on TV live as they make a joke of 66 clauses affecting, in the immediate term, 2% of the gross domestic product, but they're trying to pass it by saying, look, do your worst. So I think what this tells us again is that what we see at the moment is a requirement. One, it's a test on the institutions, but it's also a requirement for us to remember that we cannot trade off institutional reform and political reforms for good economic and technical policy, no matter how fluently we can say it. And that's what brought us back here. I won't go into the technical details about what the scenarios required. I think our view at the IEA was to simply hear what everybody says and to try to situate it here. But what I'll say is that getting to the Madaraka Realized would be enormously beneficial, but it also means that that's why it's very difficult, because development is hard. One other thing that the picture of now told us, which was basically the context before these scenarios were drawn, was the fact that Kenya fell behind its peers over the last 30 years or so. We have a study that's going to show that in a couple of weeks, but Kenya fell behind its peers. fast consolidating development is possible. And so what it means is that the best outcomes for Kenya or for any country generally is not about high growth rates in 1 year. It's about the ability to sustain them. And I think this moment in which we are tells me that regardless of Kenya Kwanza's economic management, which was decent, not as good, but decent, I think this shock is going to affect it. And that reminds us once again that it's not about stalling performance over 1 or 2 years. Sustaining a generation level of change on the economy and the political institutions is what creates the outcomes at Madaraka. So for the time being, our view is that I think we should be chastised. We should be allowed to actually think that, yes, these reforms are necessary, and none of us should think that those boys and girls going out in the streets are necessarily just irritants, and as soon as they're back, business as usual should resume. If that happens, then we'll get even further and further, and we'll boil in tensions, we'll bake in tensions, which will show up again in the medium term. Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much, Kwame, for sharing your thoughts on the scenarios. I mean, it's a conversation we have almost on a daily on different issues, and I mean, all of them linking back to these scenarios that we have come up with, because even as we're coming up with the scenarios, we have to be on the radar, we have to be on the monitoring, just to see out of our scenarios, which one is likely to play out or is actually playing out. So we want to see, if Sarah was to come back or was to wake up July 2024, would she be experiencing one of those scenarios playing out? And it's evident that yes, if Sarah came back today, then of course tidbits of each of those scenarios could be playing out for different reasons. And I like that we are talking about sustainability and consistency, because even as we come up with policies, we should sit back and ask ourselves, how sustainable are those policies we are coming up with? And then will we maintain the momentum? Will we maintain the implementation momentum required for those policies to bear fruits and just to steer the country in the right direction? And I think that is something that is always missing when we are formulating policies. So the question then is that because a lack of coherence in the policy formulation, or is it a lack of enthusiasm, for lack of a better word, from the institutions mandated to implement these policies to actually do what they need to do? So overall, but this conversation was just to jog our minds and relate it back to the scenarios and just see, are those scenarios already playing out? And if they are, what are some of the things that we can avoid? And you can clearly tell that we cannot neglect one for the other. We have to put emphasis on both the institutions, and we have to also ensure that the policies that are being implemented are very cognizant of the fact that the private sector is a huge player in our economic development, and the policies cannot then be seen to stifle their development, because the level of impact or the effect of having the private sector as a player in the country's economic development cannot be downplayed. And so, like Carol already also mentioned, these scenarios are just to help us as we plan to involve the private sector more, to jog our memory, to tell us what do we really need to look at. And clearly, the institutions and the policies cannot be downplayed. So I'll open it up for plenary. If there's anybody who has a comment, anybody who has a question that they feel they need to direct to one of our panelists, this is your moment to either type in your question, or you can use the raise the icon for raising your hand. Raise your hand, and we will give you an opportunity to ask your question, and then we can close the meeting. So anybody with a question or a comment, if you raise up your hand, we'll be able to see it, or you can feel free to type it in. Or if you want to share your views as well on the scenarios and where you think we are as a country. So Mushai is asking, is our problem just one of implementation? We have good institutional structures and generally well-written policies. This issue is a culture of implementation. So I'll have Carol go first, then Nancy.
Thanks, Mushai. And I think I agree with you. In the scenarios document, there is a statement there that says Kenya's future will depend on what Kenyans demand from their leaders. And I think you're right. To some extent, we have inbuilt relatively well-crafted institutions. And yes, there's room for improvement in terms of policy and policy direction, but there are relatively fair policies that can lead this country forward, whether from a private sector perspective or a public sector perspective. Definitely the question is then, are we demanding enough from our leaders in terms of accountability, in terms of implementation? Are we keeping the pressure up in order for us to move from where we are, which is roughly, I think there's general agreement between managed stagnation and the Juakali kingdom, to where we do have the potential to be, which is the Madaraka realized. So I think for me, the question is just, are we willing to do the hard work? I agree with Kwame. It's very difficult to see systemic change within a generation. Are we willing to put and sustain the pressure, demand from our leaders, the action that we need to see in order to move us from where we are to where we want to be? So I think I concur with your observations, Mushai.
All right, thank you, Carol. Nancy?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a very good question, Mushai. And one of the key things I would like to begin with is, first of all, to recognize where we are at this particular moment, the crisis that Kenya faces. I think for a very long time, one of the key challenges that we've always had, and when we listen to people speak about these problems, especially when you look at unemployment, inequality, corruption, why is it that there hasn't been any interventions being made? One of the key things you hear people say is that there's no political will. However, the crisis that we find Kenya in right now, where the president and his administration has been have been situated, is that we find ourselves where the interest of the political elites have intersected with the demands of the citizens. And so because of that, it seems like we are in this space where, because these are the things that whatever the citizens have been demanding for intersects now with what the political intersects with the interest of the political class. And so in a sense, if the political class can't address the interest and the demands of the citizens, it does affect how they pursue their futures. And when I talk about their futures, is that politicians' visions are usually in the here and now. They're usually focused around one particular electoral cycle, and that is how we have always planned our development interventions. And because of that, the problems that we have faced over time, especially when you look at inequality, you look at corruption, you look at the different challenges that Kenya is battling with, is that we are battling with problems that require long-term solutions. And so the question I'm asking here is that, to what extent are our institutions designed in such a way that they can address long-term problems, long-term challenges? Because some of these particular problems are intertwined, and because they are intertwined and intersect with each other, you really need a sort of a lens in which you can be able to address some of these challenges. And so if our reaction towards these particular problems is very reactive and without having to think about the long term, then we find ourselves having incremental change. However, the COVID pandemic taught us that even with incremental change, when you have a pandemic, some of those particular gains are washed off. And so the question I would really, and really the thing that I'm really thinking about is that, how do we capitalize on the moment that we have been offered as Kenyans to be able to ensure that the next steps that the government makes and the next steps that the president does make, especially when we look at the future of Kenya and where we sit right now, is that these particular issues are prioritized. Because if these issues are not prioritized, what we have seen from these particular scenarios, including with the youth scenarios, is that these are issues that are lacking in the background. They are almost like ghosts that will come and haunt us if we don't address them. And so I think responsible foresight and responsible strategic foresight requires us to be able to put up interventions ahead of time before that happens. However, I think one of the key challenges that I see right now is the constraint that the presidency seems to be experiencing, because it is quite clear that there is a crisis on legitimacy even against the government at the particular point, because of the current issues that we have seen, and also the fact that their 2027 aspirations are threatened by what we currently see at the moment. However, how do we make sure that they are able to be quite responsive, but also able to provide themselves a moment of reset to be able to begin to build a new Kenya? Because this is really a reset moment. We just were independent last year, and so being able to think about how we navigate this is quite important. I think for me, my parting shot, especially around this particular issue, is that citizens do have power, and we have seen it, and we have seen them exercise their power through Article 1, which has been provided to us. However, at this particular point, we need to make more demands, especially around how we think in the long term, how we think not just for this generation, but also for future generations. Because what is really emerging is that we have been really short term in terms of how we react to the problems, and what we need now is a long-term measure in terms of addressing the issues, but also an immediate response to what we are seeing right now.
For your response. So I'll go to Daniel. Daniel, please unmute yourself and ask your question. So as Daniel is typing in his question, anybody else with a comment or a question that they think we can address? And as Daniel is typing in his question, Carol, Nancy, and Kwame will have a round for your final comments, even as we finalize on the webinar, and as I welcome Jairus to do the final bit, just your final thoughts and views on these scenarios and your possible recommendation on what we should focus. And you might have mentioned it, but just where should we refocus our energy as a country, so that we are heading towards Madaraka Realized, given that clearly we are in between managed stagnation and Jua Kali Kingdom, but we have the prospects of getting to Madaraka Realized. So what is this that we need to do so that we are towards Madaraka Realized, as you give your closing remarks? Thank you. So Carol?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Winnie. And thank you for the opportunity to listen in on this conversation and also to contribute. I think, as has been mentioned, we are truly in a crossroads. When the new constitution was rolled out, I think there were a number of aspirations that we were looking to achieve. Embedding within our constitutional framework our aspirations around our institutional quality, around inclusion, around the Kenya that we wanted to see. And for me, I think the way forward is in not wasting this current crisis that has come about. The crisis is where there's a whole generation that has felt politically excluded. Some would say politically disconnected. Not so much in tune with what was happening at a point in time, but there has been an awakening that has come. And I think it has awakened from us many other conversations about how we engage with our government, how we engage with our governance processes. And I think it's a crisis that should not be wasted. Number one, because as I mentioned, it is causing us to test the limitations and the aspirations that were contained within the Constitution. Number two, it is presenting us an opportunity to reset our expectation around constitutional officers, around certain constitutional safeguards that were put in place, around our engagement with our government, around our engagement with how we are governed, how policies are developed. And I think it would be such a waste for us if we didn't leverage or bed down this crisis. We recognize that it requires a certain level of political goodwill. I take into account what Nancy says about alignment of interests in being key to ensuring that we move beyond the crisis into something a bit more tangible. But I think a coalescing of all of the generations around this awakening is necessary for us to move beyond just agitation or a short-term crisis or uncomfortable discussion into something much more substantive that will move into a generational change, into something that will be substantive. So I think for me, the key thing is the private sector needs to begin to engage. We can't be standoffish anymore. We need to make use of this crisis to influence and to deepen our engagement with the government and the way we are governed if we're going to see any hope of Madaraka realized. That would be it from me. Thank you, Winnie.
Thank you, Carol. Nancy?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think for me, one of the key things that I would say is that the bottom-up economic transformation model is one that is very, when you look at it and you look at the Madaraka realized, it's almost, especially, it's what Kenya should be and should ideally be, especially in paper. However, we also have to realize the constraints that this particular model has had to face because of the different competing interests that has made it ineffective. And so one, domestically, we obviously need to address the issue of corruption. That is nothing that we cannot lie about, and we cannot be able to sugarcoat it, especially addressing the major accountability issues right in the different arms of government, including decolonizing our public sector. Because I don't know whether any one of you watched the gentleman who tried to get into who photobombed the Minister of Finance when they were taking the picture of the budget on that particular day. This gentleman makes a very interesting presentation in the courts, and he really questions a number of things. I would really advise any one of you to just listen to him. And it really speaks to the decolonization of some of these institutions, because we've had a constitution that is very progressive. However, this particular constitution cannot sit under a system that is yet to be decolonized. Even the British who set up these systems have now modernized their systems, and their systems are no longer the way in which they were, because colonial systems were extractive in nature. And so they were not really made to develop a country or a nation. And so we really need to go back to the drawing board and look at which particular systems, especially our public sector, do have semblance of what was set up in the colonial times, because these are extractive systems, and it's what we have seen over time. Because if the corruption that we are seeing right now has been built over 50 years, how do we expect to dismantle it within the next 5 years? And so the question would be, the president really needs to listen to what the people have been saying and what the Gen Z have been saying. And the best way to be able to see that is even the visuals and the different images that emerge from these particular protests. And you will sort of see that really Kenyans don't really have a problem of paying taxes. Kenyans want to know what is the value for money for the taxes they pay. They are willing to do that if they know that they're going to get quality healthcare, that they're going to be able to access education, but they'll also be able to do their business without having to know anyone. And any child finishing school, whether university or primary school, should be able to apply for whatever job they want and be able to get it without having to know a rich uncle or a cousin who works in the ministry or whatever. And I think that is the Kenya that we need. And obviously, we do understand that the president is has made attempts to be able to address the current crisis. However, these particular issues cannot just be done the way in which they have. It cannot just be haphazard, because I've seen a number of dialogues being set up, a lot of task forces being set up, yet Kenyans are saying that we need to be able to address corruption, which is at the center of this. Businesses need to be are interested in understanding how the Bribery Act can actually come into fruition, but also whistleblowing, especially where there are still instances of such kinds of practices. I think for me, in my closing part and my closing shot, is that the Kenya Kwanza administration has been offered a clean slate and an opportunity to be able to reset and to be able to think about what a new Kenya is. Presidents are often remembered in the context of the crisis they navigate. Obviously, the presidency and the leadership around the presidency faces a number of constraints, but it comes a time where you have to make trade-offs, and the trade-off that our presidency and the leadership around him and even his advisors, that they have to make is that they have to choose whether they need to walk Kenya into this new path, or to sort of let things stay as they are. Because if things stay the way they are, then we sort of walk ourselves into a Jua Kali or an Eastern type kind of scenario. And I think what the Kenyans are saying, and based on the different conversations in the different spaces, is that the system is broken and it's time to make it. So that is basically my parting shots.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for your final remarks and for your just your general views on what we should do. So I'll head over to Kwame. And Kwame, as you give your closing remarks and what you think, what we should do as a country, there's a question for you from Daniel. So you could actually respond to that as you give your final remarks. Thank you. It's on the chat box.
Okay, so I read the question from Daniel. It says that the question challenging the nation's accountability and sincere inclusivity issue. Are there any indicators of sincerity in navigating the crisis, especially on part of actors in state, and how the markets are likely to adjust to this crisis in short and medium term? Thanks. Well, that's a difficult question. I think the way to judge the intentions of this administration, and my view is we should not focus on the president, because the constitution gives us institutions from the judiciary, parliament, which performed badly. And I think the president was doing a cleanup for them by rejecting the law. So we need not put pressure entirely only on the president, though he's the one who still thinks the police did a good job. But we need to apply and to be eternally vigilant, in my view, for all the institutions of state and people who have responsibilities. So that's a first. If we do that, we'll realize that there's no superhero who's going to solve our problems for us, right? Even though some politicians suddenly are very good at inserting themselves in crisis and suddenly asking the youth to engage in conversations, even though the youth asked him to shut up. But the point is, there are no superheroes. I think building a nation, especially if we expect for it to endure, means necessarily that it will have crises such as this. And while I agree with those who say that a crisis should not be wasted, I think so too. We have to be conscious that some of the language I hear from the administration is that stability comes first, as they interpret it. And so what that might mean is that we might be given the false choice that stability should come at the expense of public engagement, public participation, and the expression of dissent. That is not a trade-off we should accept, regardless of who it comes from. That is a trade-off we should not accept. I think people should be entitled to expressing their views, whether as individuals or in collectives, provided, as the Constitution says, peaceably and without unnecessary harm to other people. So that's basically it. I also don't think that this administration, I read this with, I watched a 14-minute clip about a student from the Kenya School of Law who was abducted. Yes, that's the word, abducted. And suddenly ended up somewhere in Murang'a near a river. I don't know whether they intended to drown him or not, but for some reason he was saved by the residents of this place near a river in Maragua, and then brought back here. The story that he told tells me that, guys, let's not lie to ourselves. We have a sophisticated, well, very simplistic PR machine from the state, but this is not a state that intends to respect the rights within the Bill of Rights, or at least not now. So unless the signal is unrelenting, we might have ourselves actually being back, and all these questions that we have would be basically just a circling of the wagons and all that. So no, I think we have slick talkers coming on microphones to try and pacify the public with the view that this will pass and then it'll be business as usual. That part worries me and worries me a lot. And so we have to know that it's too early to tell, but on the whole, the signals that the state has given me is people who speak from both sides of their mouths. So on the one side, you say this on TV, but on the other side, the abductions continue. And of course, the disappearances, and we have very, very regrettable cases of people arrested without warrants, disappeared, in some cases being found having died and drowned. Those are not good images that Kenya should be seeing in 2024, and we are certainly not heading to Madaraka if that is what continues to happen. So we must not focus entirely on the fact that there's a rejection of the finance bill for 2024 and forget on the other side. A government that cannot manage civil rights and not respect them, whilst they are stated in the constitution, will not implement good constitutional reforms for the long term. So far, if you ask me, on the whole, I would take a wait and see attitude, but on the whole, I think the vigilance should maintain. And I agree with the youth who seem to think, or rather the Gen Zs or whoever it is, these, what we think the leaderless, formless, organic institution that still is distrustful of the state. The credibility of this government, I think the Kenyan government, in my view, because I'm a policy guy, I tend to be cynical, or rather I tend to be circumspect. This has shocked me. The reversals have been too quick. They're furtive, but it worries me still. So I don't think we're heading to Madaraka. For us to go all there, I think all of us have to be candid, call it out, and to avoid the streak of fear that some people hope we will have to not call these things out. So yesterday's announcement about the formation of the IEBC and everything else, in my view, seems to be a theater performance. The real work that needs to be done is not being done, or at least I haven't seen evidence of it, and I hope it is. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Kwame, for answering Daniel's question. I hope, Daniel, you're satisfied with the response from Kwame, and thank you to Carol and Nancy for joining and for giving us your closing remarks. So my work here is done. I would now like to invite my colleague Jairus, who will now give us the closing remarks and the way forward moving from here. So Jairus, karibu sana.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. I would like to conclude this meeting, and this is what I would like to say before I bring it to a close. Listening to our speakers, I think we have all been enriched, especially on understanding scenarios and being able to get an answer to the question like where we are now as a country and where we could be headed. And there's this one, the Madaraka realized scenario where we all wish to be. And as we've heard from our speakers, it's not just about sitting down and letting things roll, but there's work to do on institutions and on policies. There's work to be done before we get to that dream scenario, which is the best case for us. Having said that, we've come to the end of our meeting, and I would like to appreciate our speakers, Nancy Muigai and Carol Misiko and Kwame Owino. Winnie, thank you for the moderation and giving us a background of the scenarios. I also like to appreciate our IT and communication team for making this a success. Finally, and equally important, I want to appreciate everyone for creating time for this important engagement, and I hope we'll carry on the conversation. The publication on the scenarios is on our website. So I encourage everyone to check our website and download and read. And for further engagements, our lines of communication are open. So get to us so that we are able to continue discussing these even as we chart the future of the country. Finally, IEA is a membership organization, and I encourage you, those who have not joined, to be able to join, either as institutions or individuals, and reach out to our communication team to guide you through that. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Thank you so much, Jairus, and thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day. Asanteni.
Thank you.